Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Kyle Kerwin, founder and CEO here at Big Eye, and today I have with me Eleanor, the Chief Operating Officer of Big Eye, and Zach, the Head of Partnerships at Big Eye, and they recently went to the Gartner Data and Analytics Summit in the UK, and I'm very excited to do some Q&A and chat with them about what they saw there. Eleanor and Zach, thanks for joining us on the webinar today.
Pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, so jumping in, we were lucky, I think, to spend the last Monday to Wednesday last week in London at the Excel Centre with a gathering of, I think, around 3,500, something like that, data analytics leaders, not just from the UK, but really from across EMEA as a whole, but gathering in London, what I think is the kind of premier Gartner event in the region. And so we attended the keynote and wanted on this webinar to share some kind of key themes that came out of that keynote. The theme, the core theme introduced at the conference was, the same as really led in Gartner in Orlando, which is around collective intelligence. So really bringing human intelligence and, AI together as a powerful generator of business value, and still kind of brought together with lots of kind of animal imagery and themes, which that was a consistent from the session in Orlando, the use of the octopus, the elephant, and many others that kind of came through. Some kind of critical points that came out, I think, is on the next slide, which I think is a very powerful one, about how data analytics maturity positively impacts financial performance by 30%. I love it when it's possible through research to really kind of tie all the work that everyone does, all of the investments they make in all the different tools that are available, to a very clear business outcome. So that to me was one of the, standout points from that opening presentation. Zach, any standout moments for you?
Yeah, I think along with the DNA maturity, in improving financial performance, it showed that leveraging and Gen AI and having a focus on building Gen AI into your business strategy also had similar impact across increasing your financial performance versus your peers in the space.
And as somebody who was not here for this one, but I was here for Orlando. So at Orlando, I felt like they were obviously talking about Gen AI a ton. The thing that I think was a big theme, at least in Orlando, was the impact of having a strategy for doing data management, which was kind of, I think, very interesting. I was expecting a lot of, excitement about Gen AI and not as much temperance. And there was some temperance on the, you have to get data management right first in order for your Gen AI strategy to work. Was that also the tone here? Was this? It sounds like human machine interaction was much more of a theme. How did that compare to Orlando?
Definitely similarly to Orlando, there was less of Gen AI being completely in your face everywhere at the conference and in the keynote, and there was a bit of tempered caution to it in understanding that while greatly beneficial, there may need to be some caution applied towards it, and really making sure that your data was AI ready was very much more the focus around this, that there's a strong governance piece behind this before you start leveraging Gen AI within different pillars of your business.
And taking it one step further, a similar focus on execution. So I think there's the statistic around 3% strategy and 97% execution. And so that remained a theme throughout the conference. It's about doing data management well in order to be able to leverage the potential of Gen AI throughout the organization. And that was very much consistent with what we heard in Orlando.
And did they tie that to this number as well? Like when I see data and analytics maturities tied to financial performance, is this more referring to traditional data and analytics maturity, or is this relevant to the Gen AI theme also?
I think from my perspective, they were rolling DNA maturity and saying Gen AI and AI data readiness is part of that as well. And rather than treating it as this separate kind of wild beast on its own, that is, outside of your standard, processes, your standard considerations for data literacy, all these things, that now that should be coming under the same umbrellas that the rest of your focus on DNA is.
Did they make any comment about how much that's actually the case? Because I think we've heard about a lot of enterprises out there where they put together a Tiger team last year, or it was sort of a standalone effort to go and do some exploratory use case kind of stuff. Did they comment much about how that is playing out in terms of Gen AI initiatives being a separate thing versus being part of like core data or part of core enterprise existing platform teams?
There weren't any specific examples, of that in the keynote. This was more a kind of direction to the industry of, this is how, Gartner believes it should be done. So it was a recommendation, I think, and I'm sure consistent with probably what they're recommending in, multiple other inquiry calls and things as well. But not as many case studies. There may have been in a number of other sessions, but not in the keynote. If we move on to the next slide, this was another big takeaway from the keynote. So I talked about an animal theme. One of my kind of top memories from the keynote was the cow analogy for Gen AI. Apparently, there are 5.1 million cows in the UK, and apparently they are the largest cause of animal-related death in the UK. I have yet to validate either of these stats, although I intend to, and feel free for anyone listening to this to also validate these for me. And their view, amusingly presented in the keynote, was that you should treat Gen AI in the same way that you should treat a cow, which is with the appropriate degree of caution. Because apparently the cause of all these cow-related human deaths is because people in the UK have the right to access, and so will walk through farmers' fields without the due respect for the cows within. And so I thought this was a very amusing and memorable way of presenting Gen AI risks, and also unexpected in the context of the Gartner presentation.
Are cows falling on people?
There's
Did
so
they
much
say
more
how these happen?
so much more we need to uncover.
So
Zach,
many
help me here.
questions.
Yeah, they did not get into details about where these cow-related injuries and fear of cows should be related to. Just the simple stats around, how many deaths were occurring related to this animal. But I thought it did tell a good cautionary tale that tied back in to some issues companies have had with Gen AI chatbots offering vehicles way too low for sale, lawsuits around Gen AI giving bad advice through customer portals and websites, and how the responsibility, while trying to be litigated to not be the responsibility of the company presenting that Gen AI, ultimately was owned by them, and was those results that were put out were going to be their problem if litigation were to come about. So it definitely spoke back to that aspect of AI data readiness, governance, and kind of treating Gen AI with caution as you do these cows. Tied it back in very well to that concept.
I'm neither a lawyer or an economist formally, but it does seem like having your cake and eating it too. If you can get the financial upside from putting a Gen AI based model somewhere out in your customer facing surface area, but then you're going to absolve yourself from the downsides on that. Oh, I think I heard about an airline where they were giving out promo codes or discounts or something. I imagine the backlash on that if you tried to walk that back afterwards would be pretty rough.
And these were pretty recent legal cases that they shared from, February this year. So definitely some interesting legal updates and kind of caution on Gen AI, something that we didn't hear at all last year on the conference circuit.
Because everybody was just starstruck about what could even be done, and they weren't yet thinking about like, okay, but what happens if it goes, a little sideways?
Yep.
And did they give some of those specific examples of like how things have kind of blown up here or there, or the litigation cases? Did they raise those during the talk?
Yes, that was where that was prompted from. They gave some examples exactly to that point of litigation that they were trying to fight back and say, well, the model generated this. It's not necessarily their responsibility, and it didn't play well and did not go in their favor at the end of the day. They were the owner of that end resultant product that produced those recommendations and things that were causing issues.
Yeah, I think most people might agree with that treatment.
So I think from there, I'd love to touch upon the data observability session that was, led by Jason Med, which for a start was completely sold out. So there was, I think, 300 plus people in the room itself. There was a number of, people standing outside, kind of streaming it if they couldn't get into the session in order not to miss it. So again, more shifts from what we've seen at Gartner in previous years, as data observability really did seem to be an underpinning theme for the whole conference, along with Gen AI.
Exciting.
Yeah,
People standing in the hallway.
Mm-hmm.
there were people standing inside of the session as well. I was inside at the time. That it was standing room only inside the session as well. And definitely, even in the keynote, it was brought up as data observability being a sort of a core piece of AI data readiness. So it is becoming very forefront now. And then, obviously you could see that with the popularity of the session that was coming through.
And we had a booth from Big Eye at the conference, and many attendees would come and share that same view, that they felt data observability and Gen AI were the underpinning themes that Gartner was really pushing at the conference this year.
I know Melody's session at Orlando was pretty full. I don't know if there were folks like standing outside or something, but Orlando, I mean, it was a pretty large room as well. It could have easily held several hundred people. But it makes sense to me. I think I would anticipate questions from folks about like, how does data observability work with Gen AI? Is there some sort of unique integration that you need to do? And I found in practice the answer is, maybe a little less interesting or exciting than you might think, where it's like, well, if you have a model and it's consuming data, or if you have a RAG or something like that, it's effectively the same as a data product or an analytics dashboard or something like that, and all the same techniques apply if you want to make sure that the pipeline feeding that thing is healthy or not. Did they talk much about that, or did they make it sound like did they talk about the intersection of data observability and Gen AI, or were those just two big tracks but separated, or how did they handle that?
I think you've just suggested a very interesting theme as to how this should evolve in the conversation for next year. It's very much that reliable data and data quality is a foundation and underpinning for Gen AI, but exactly how, I don't think any of the sessions that I attended, were starting to kind of unpick that yet. Zach, I don't know if you
yeah, I share the same opinion. The one underpinning they had to data observability was a focus on quality data being fed into these training data models and RAGs, as Kyle mentioned. So it was a focus on data observability, overarching, covering data quality and being able to monitor that and make sure your data is healthy and of quality as you feed it in.
So picking up on what we have on the screen here, something that Jason Med shared was in relation to the hype cycles that Gartner produces, that in 2023, data observability went from being a nice to have to being a must have for organizations, which I feel is a real kind of line in the sand moment for a kind of sector that's been talked about a lot, and kind of really that sense that it's now a critical component of data management.
And is that's something that he articulated like directly during the talk?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is a direct quote.
Yeah, I mean, I've experienced sort of the change organically over the last several years. I mean, obviously we've been in the space for a little while, and I still remember having to explain even the concept of data observability at all from a theoretical standpoint several years ago to then it started to shift to like, well, yeah, I've heard of it, I haven't used it, or we don't have a budget for it, but I'm generally aware of it. And to see it changing like this, like just year over year, I mean, even Gartner Orlando wasn't even a year ago. So to see sort of changes on like even a 6-month span or something like that in the market from customers and from the analyst community is pretty exciting.
And I think scope has been an interesting part of the conversation in relation to Gartner's views around data observability. And I was very interested in the change from Jason's presentation to Melody's in Orlando, in that there was a lot of just use of and more. So we've talked about the 5 pillars previously. So data pipelines, access data infrastructure, FinOps, and more. And so this, in every single time there was a list that was presented, it had this same end. So a sense that we've yet to see what the total scope of data observability will be in the market. Yes. So that have been presented, and this was first released over a year ago at the Data Analytics Summit in the US, this concept of the 5 pillars of data observability. And in Orlando, Melody spoke about the potential of adding 2 more, so privacy and security. I think in this one, Jason added BI analytics as a potential additional pillar. And then when I followed up afterwards and spoke there may be the potential, he said, for there to be up to 9 pillars next year.
Fine.
Which is why I feel we're building a pantheon at this point, or really a fairly substantial building of the kind of data management architecture that's being held up and supported by these multiple pillars of data observability.
For privacy security, I get it. You might want to know things like, where, like which my columns, are potentially like sensitive columns.
Literally
There's
columns.
Literally columns. Yes. So that one was very clear. With BI, I feel like there's a lot of different directions you can take that. Did he give any indication, or like did he go into any detail at all about like what analytics observability might be? As an example, like one obvious one is in my lineage graph, in terms of like doing impact analysis, when we find a problem, you'd want to know about what are all the impacted dashboards and analytics that are downstream. Mm-hmm. That's one version of observability for analytics, right? Is like what's going to be affected by what. But then there's another version, something that we've heard from folks that we've talked to as well, is how much observability can you do inside the analytics dashboard? Can you tell me about computed fields? Can you tell me about changes in KPIs and things like that? Did he give any indication about what flavor he is anticipating?
Not in the presentation itself, but I think we are increasingly hearing about, the ability to observe the analytics within the dashboard itself as being a growing area of potential interest. I was interested actually that Gen AI analytics wasn't on the list in the actual presentation. So given all the other conversations and given, the question that you asked earlier around the intersection between the two, that wasn't on his list. But I think he's really just both listening to the market and throwing down a gauntlet to the market. I think it's a two-way process here of really identifying how many pillars are required to hold up the data management building.
There's a lot of stuff to observe out there.
Zach, in terms of the various pillars, as I say, I've just highlighted that everything came with an and more. So there was no sense that we'd reached the end or the full delineation at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that we're pushing on. So yeah, I can say just from being around the booth that we had, your point about privacy potentially becoming a pillar, it was asked about a lot in terms of observability. I think just in a general sense of you naturally associate with that is something we're going to start looking at. Whereas our PII data headed, who has access to it, things along those lines. So I think the term observability is starting to overarch and as you said, Eleanor, kind of listen to the market as what they'd expect if we are fully observing our data. What sort of data points do we need back on that?
Zach, do you think that's because we were in London and we had a big, European kind of, number of people that were involved in that conversation? Would you say that privacy was a bigger theme in the conversations as a result?
Yes, I would say it's a much bigger theme. GDPR concerns are definitely much more out there in even starting any conversation around it, understanding where, the underlying software you may be using, where it lives, what sort of data would be exposed. It was early on questions to see if it was something that was going to be viable for them. And then I think the aspect of compliance and observability helping with those compliance efforts came after that to see if they could start to ascertain that data was only going out to the right hands at that time and be identifying if it was getting exposed in any way and get ahead of those problems so they don't get involved with the massive fines that can come with GDPR compliance issues.
If we head to the next screen, I think this was a consistent theme introduced first earlier this year on the difference between embedded data observability and standalone data observability solutions. So if you take the example of something like cost management, there are embedded cost management functions within some of the cloud data warehouses like Databricks and Snowflake, whereas standalone tools, like Big Eyes, has the ability to go across a number of different technologies and be able to provide a kind of single or end-to-end view of the kind of the observations that you're looking at. And so this concept remained, and I think is becoming kind of more clearly a part of the kind of Gartner's thinking.
I remember this being brought up in the talk at Orlando as well, and it was nice to see it called out and kind of have some clear definition placed around it. Because I remember a year ago now, no, almost two, I think, when Snowflake and Databricks sort of both unveiled some embedded, data observability features in Snowflake's and in Unity Catalog. And there were a lot of questions about, like, is this a feature? How far is this going to go? Does it turn into a product or something like that? And, like, I think that, so I was at Melody's talk. I didn't get to hear Jason speak, obviously, at the UK because I wasn't there, but it was interesting to see it broken down into this bifurcation between, you can get observability from this particular piece of your pipeline, and maybe that's the warehouse or maybe it's the lake, but it could also potentially be you could get embedded observability inside of your data integration system or inside of your data modeling tool or something like that, because they could all be publishing their own relevant metadata out into some central store. And she talked a bit about not necessarily that these two are in contention, but rather that they are applied differently, and that you may get embedded observability from a whole bunch of different pieces along your pipeline. And then you may have a standalone product that they're all pushing information into. But what's nice about that from the perspective of somebody who's building on the standalone side is that splits the work of achieving observability between the standalone tool maker and the individual the people that are building the pieces in the pipeline, because historically we've had to go and crawl any metadata that we need access to out of those systems. And if we start to move into a world where you have a lot of embedded observability features in Snowflake, in Tableau, in Fivetran, et cetera, then it actually makes life much easier for anybody who's working on one of the standalone platforms like ourselves, because we can just consume data from those embedded tools instead of having to hand roll absolutely everything. So it's nice to see that kind of put into clearer terms like that. I hope that other folks in the industry are thinking about it the same way.
Yeah, I think it shows the growing maturity of the industry, and customer expectations, which solutions have to meet, whether they are a standalone solution. But I think more the pressure is on tools to provide embedded solutions for this. And that shows just how aware customers are of the value of data observability and the need to have it both in the individual platforms they're using and if they're using a data observability tool itself.
I think it was
nice to see. Sorry, Zach.
I was going to say, I think it was also referenced as it's a good place to start. That in these tools embedded, you already have some observability options, but they did call out, especially in Jason's talk, that it's very use case specific. You're not necessarily looking for unknown unknowns. It's not treating your business as a specific unique entity that's going to have a lot of customization needed for it. And that's where, this aspect of standalone tools, and I think to Kyle's point of being able to blend some of what is in the embedded observability options, bringing those into a tool that allows more flexibility to really get end-to-end coverage for your business is what's going to make the most sense in the long term.
You're going to get like sort of foundational metrics and things like that. Like if I just to go back to the Fivetran example, how long does a sync job take to run? Like basic statistic, you're going to want to publish that for any job. Doesn't have anything to do with your business or specifically how you're using Fivetran. So getting each of the tools in somebody's pipeline to be able to emit basic foundational statistics like that into a standalone solution that is draped over the entire pipeline would be nice. But yeah, I think to your point, they're not incentivized to go all the way down to the level of customization that you need to cover, like custom business stuff that you'd want to be able to monitor. Is there some relationship between these columns? How are they correlated? Something like that. I wouldn't expect an embedded feature to go that far because they just don't have an incentive to go there.
Yeah. I think if we go on to the next slide, there's some interesting guidance on kind of how to pick the right solution. They ran through a list of the kind of embedded functionality that was available in other tools, and then I think they actually highlighted 4 data observability providers that they recommended people should visit, including Big I, and talked about 2 different criteria for choosing your solution, both technical fit and then also non-technical components that you should consider. So some very helpful and very clear, procurement advice really from Gartner.
Yeah, and I thought the technical fit, end of it was a bit more of the obvious end of, does it connect to the platforms you're using? Does it scale to your scale that you need to do the security options, cover what you need to. But then from the non-technology side, it was really interesting. I think more specific to a lot of organizations of what use cases do they have, looking at the user friendliness of the tool, if this is going to be exposed to downstream data consumers as well as the data engineering teams. Does it allow for that? Is it something you could work with? So there are a lot of I think interesting considerations from how wide spanning this tool might be within the user base of a given company, rather than just I think in the past more traditionally it was thought of as a data engineering tool. It's starting to span outside of that with some of the things that are offered.
Yeah, I had exactly the same takeaway of data observability moves out of doing just a data engineering solution and starts to resonate and provide value to the business users, analytics teams, etc. And that being a kind of another shift that we've seen both in this conference and more generally in the market.
Oh, this was, I mean, I hope anybody listening knows that we launched, some pretty big product features back in March, did dependency-driven monitoring. I feel like that fits very well into this theme of saying like, hey, it's great if the data team, even if it's the data governance team, not just data engineering, but still pretty core data platform kind of folks, it's great if they can roll out a product like this. But at the end of the day, your business analyst who's embedded in the accounting team needs to be able to get value out of this, because they've got to say, this is the dashboard that I built to report on something that, folks are looking at every Friday morning. Is that thing reliable or not? And if the observability tool can't actually work for that individual, then you've really only got, some pieces of the puzzle, maybe still valuable pieces, but you haven't really painted the whole picture that the business is ultimately looking for, which is if I'm using my analytics product at the end of my pipeline, do the folks that are using it know whether they can trust it or not? It's cool to hear that called out.
And it's something Gartner have been talking about for a long time, that as an industry, we've previously missed in not meeting that requirement. And I think we've all been listening to the market and addressing that problem.
A bunch of data people start a company to do data observability, and they build tools for other data people. It's shocking. No, it's really cool though. I mean, I think while we were at Gartner, hopefully this was at the demo in the UK also, but in Orlando, we showed folks the ability to see summarized data quality information about their Tableau dashboard directly in a sidecar in their browser as an extension, so that they can get that information right there at their fingertips. So I'm excited to keep building more features in that direction that are applicable to somebody they're not going to go and look at the full lineage pipeline. They're not going to go look at, a particular anomaly or do root cause analysis, but they do need to know whether or not they can trust something. And there's just so much more that can be built for folks like that and kind of get that information at their fingertips.
And then wrapping up this in line with, the keynote and this focus on kind of practical execution. If we go to the next slide, and there was definitely this theme of, you don't need to rip everything out. So, a much more pragmatic approach to identifying what's working, what isn't working, where you can start to add data observability into your environment, where you can start to perhaps transition some of your existing rules, and being able to make that migration in a kind of managed, sustainable way. And that, I think, again, just aligned with the overall approach of good data management.
As opposed to if people got it in their head that whatever legacy system they're using for data quality, that they're going to have to go and completely migrate that entire thing, do a huge lift and shift or something like that. This is kind of dispelling that.
Well, or just don't start until you feel ready. If the feeling is don't start till you're ready to do that, then you're missing out. So, take advantage of some of the things that data observability can offer you by incrementally adding it into your environment, versus feeling that it's a either or, you must rip everything out in order to kind of get started. There was a very interesting tone around this, actually came into kind of cost management as well, where although Gartner have introduced all these pillars, Jason said, focus first on stabilizing the pipeline. And then once you've got your pipeline stabilized, then you can focus on how you can run everything more, cost effectively. And so there's very much a sense of kind of staged progression of a rollout within your environment and a rollout of your priorities.
That sounds like that's going to be the same advice for a lot of stuff. I mean, I think about, for example, like your data warehouse. if you're going to be building analytics on top of your warehouse, you got to actually build the analytics and you got to actually use them and figure out whether or not they're actually helping the business make better decisions or not. And then once those are in place, then you can start to tighten the screws and figure out how do we not spend so much. You can optimize the way that you're querying. You can, change the layout of your data model or something like that. I imagine that's exactly the same thing here, which is if the pipeline's not even reliable or not, what's the point of saving money on it? Because it's not even producing business value yet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think this was overarching to the keynote and the whole theme of planning, start small, but then scale quickly after that, get to the execution phase very quickly. So they did talk about with observability, bridging the gaps, looking at what was offered and embedded and what gaps that would bridge, looking at standalone tools, what gaps that would bridge, and then building towards a holistic solution, down the line. And I think that spoke to many aspects of what they were talking about at Gartner, even outside of data observability, is that focus of get started, start executing on it.
Start small, score some wins, go from there.
Well, I think if we go on to the next slide, there was one other session that I went to, which was about the politics of data analytics, which was a fun session, had a lot of interaction and response from the audience. And I felt that perhaps was hitting on some of the real challenges that people were experiencing running a data analytics team in their organization. They highlighted 7 different, political challenges. Examples being, we'll talk about being data driven, but data quality and the challenges of ensuring that actually made people steer away from really being data driven. So that was just one, but there was 3 others that I wanted to just mention. One was around the implied insult of data literacy. So by introducing data literacy programs, you were in many ways just implying that your team didn't really know what they were doing in the first place. And so generally a reframing of that whole approach. So it's very much politics of how you could be successful in the organization. Another one, a similar theme, which I don't know if we've put on one of the slides, was around, moving from the concept of kind of data ownership and data sharing to, data custodianship. Because the idea of sharing implies this is mine, and I'm kind of in some way benevolently sharing it with you, as opposed to we all have responsibility in organizations to generate data that we can contribute to the successful, running of the business. And so again, just a kind of reframing as to this kind of a sense of mine, yours, ownership, control, and making this much more collaborative in the ways of kind of building, when you're building data products and building consensus. And so I thought that was a very interesting session. And then the one that probably got the biggest laugh from the audience was the market for unregulated dashboards, and the sense of this kind of undercover black market of dashboards that are produced and traded and used within the organization. So having the concept of dark data and everything else is prevalent, but now these unregulated dashboards that are proliferating through the organization. So this whole session, if anyone's as a Gartner member wants to go and take a look, it was a fun session, I think, treading on probably some very real challenges that people have within their organizations as they're trying to implement so many of these strategic objectives and the challenges of execution. So definitely a fun one to end on.
Did they give any suggestions on where to go with those things, or are they more highlighting them as like easier?
Every one of them had a solution, kind of problem solution format across the 7 different areas that they counted down on.
Yeah, I imagine suggesting that your teammates are in any form illiterate is maybe not the right approach.
Indeed.
I think in the scheme of Gen AI, at least, though, when they talked about data literacy, it was something new and would be new to many folks. So maybe a bit less insulting on that end when they bring Gen AI into the data literacy conversation.
The proposal was just not to frame it as data literacy. The proposal was to frame it as training, make it a part of your broader, training programs, management training rollout, but just to steer clear of the word literacy, as although it's kind of been adopted within the data management world, that perhaps for your broader colleagues, it may not be the best way of introducing some of these topics.
That makes sense to me. Any sort of final thoughts? And you went to both, so you got a chance to compare and contrast. And are there any others the rest of this year as well?
I think Tokyo is ongoing this week. So, that's happening. And I know that Australia in Sydney is taking place at the end of July. So there are definitely, and I think there are definitely a couple more taking place before the end of the year.
All right. Then Zach, any closing thoughts on your side?
I think, closing thoughts from my end, the messaging was fairly consistent from, the US based conference and the UK based conference. And it's seeing that similar messaging is resonating globally as opposed to just domestically inside of the US. And, even with GDPR concerns, things like that, there is an overarching aspect here that, data observability is a focus, and monitoring data is something that is necessary and makes sense, not just from a Gen AI perspective, but in all of analytics.
All right. Well, if you haven't gotten a demo of Big Eye before and you're curious about what Gartner's talking about with all this data observability stuff, we'd love to connect with you and show you a bit about our platform. You can scan the QR code here, and it's super easy to book a demo with us. And otherwise, Eleanor and Zach, thanks for joining me today for today's webinar and telling us a bit about the Gartner Summit in the UK.
Thanks so much.